thank you very much for joining our webinar. We're really, well, actually thrilled that you turned up for this, because it came out of a few occasions where Jo had been helping me on my training courses, like she often does. And when people are asking, questions, she quite often is saying, oh, there's a really good business analysis technique for that, because Jo is a very experienced business analyst, if I can say it. And, it came as just a silly remark at the end of one of these courses when I said to Jo last year, you really ought to do a course on this, because it's really, really valuable. And we just kind of didn't think anymore and brushed it aside. But earlier in the summer, Jo actually said to me, did you mean that? Should we do something? And we decided that rather than go for a course, we'd actually just do a webinar and see whether other people thought they were as useful for data governance as we thought they were. So that is how today came about, and we're really thrilled that so many of you thought it would be useful as well. So I suppose just very quick introductions. I'm Nicola Ascombe. I'm known as a data governance coach, if you haven't come across me before. I just made it my mission to help as many people as possible be successful in data governance. So doing joint ventures like this with Jo just really helps that incredibly. Jo, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jo Fulford, and I'm the founder of Fruitful Data, and I help not-for-profit organisations tackle their bad quality data. So data governance is obviously a key element in that. Nicola and I have worked together on various things over the last few years, and as she says, we quite often realised, that there are other things that we have not necessarily realised could help each other out. So that's what this morning's webinar is all about.
Excellent. So what we're going to do is share 3 techniques with you, and given that it's Jo's area of expertise, I'm going to let her share the actual business analysis technique with you, and then I'm going to join in and explain how we've seen it work well for data governance. But if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat box, and we will answer as many as we have time for at the end. So let's get started, and over to you, Jo.
Okay, right, I'm going to leave you to carry on admitting people to the waiting room. Fantastic. So when Nicola runs her training course on getting started in data governance, the second day we often talk about particular challenges that people are experiencing, and we group those together, and three of the theme areas that usually come out are where to start, and this kind of sense of overwhelm, and it just feels like a massive task, and how do you sort of approach it so that you feel like you can really get some traction, but know that you've got your eye on the whole thing. The second area is about roles and responsibilities, so particularly thinking about data owners, data stewards, and how do you identify who the right people are going to be for these new roles and responsibilities. And the third sort of category that a lot of questions fall into is relate to culture change, and how do we, obviously implementing a data governance framework is a massive culture change for lots of organisations, and so how do you, sort of take that on board, especially if you've not come from a culture change, background. And you may be the one that's instigating the change, or you may be participating in change that's being led by someone else. So either way, the technique that I'm going to share with you to do with that will help you kind of identify where change might be getting a bit stuck, even if you're not actually responsible for leading it. So on the where to start, we're going to look at business activity models, which can also be known as BAMs. Roles and responsibilities, there's something called the stakeholder wheel, which I'll take you through, and then the third one, culture change. There's a change model by somebody called Cotter, and we'll take a look at that. And they all have very different levels of detail in them. So if you think, oh, this is very quick, or this is very much in depth, you'll find the next one is completely different. So they're very, very varied. Okay, so moving on, if I can do that. So first of all, business activity models. So here's a sample of one that I did for a client. I suppose the starting point with this is that in Nicola's course, she usually talks about using a conceptual data model to identify the data that you're going to need to cover in your data governance framework. And that's already sort of diving in quite a bit of detail. Whereas a business activity model is kind of the level above, so it's really looking at the activities rather than getting straight into the data detail level. And this modelling technique is used principally for gap analysis. So what you do is you talk to different stakeholders and you create a business activity model for each of their different perspectives. And it can be really interesting because obviously people get very, very focused on what it is that they do and what it is that they contribute to an organisation. And they often sort of forget about some of the other sort of key, and obviously assume that that's all happening as it is, and they're very focused on their thing. So you speak to different stakeholders and build a separate model for each of those areas, and then you consolidate it and bring it all together. And what's really nice is it means that as you go along and validate it with people, they know that you've covered everything that they've talked about. They can see how it's been included in the bigger picture, and it's quite an easy to digest format. So it's not just like a long list of things that go on, and it means that. So you end up with this, this big picture, and they can see how they fit in, but they can also see that everything else is represented. So it means that they are reassured that you've been quite systematic in how you've gone across the whole of the organisation, or whichever part you're focusing on. But it also means that they can be reassured that you're going to be systematic with then how you use this and apply it in whatever context. And obviously today we're thinking about data governance. So I really, really like this because it does kind of really simplify what an organisation is about. So I will take you through the different elements of it. And then Nicola's going to talk about how that could be used from a data governance perspective. So there's 5 different types of activities. You've got do activities in blue, which are the key thing, the purpose or the why of your organisation. So, for example, if you're a clothing retailer, your one blue doing activity would be sell clothes. That's it. That's what you're about. There's nothing else to it. That's your purpose. And the green activities which sit underneath it are your enabling activities. So they're all the things that you have to have in place in order to do your doing activity. And it's really important to emphasise here that this isn't a business process flow. So this isn't a sequence of tasks that have to be done in order, but it's really about having activities in place that support the delivery of the doing activity. So again, if you think about the clothing retailer, they'd need to have, point of sale systems in place. They'd need to have, stock in the stores. They'd need to have, leases on properties and all that kind of stuff. And so all those things need to be in place in order for them to sell clothes. Underneath that, you've got the yellow planning activities, and this is really decisions about resources. So, who and what budget and, tools and, other things that need to be made available. And then at the top, you've got pink monitoring activities. These relate directly to the blue doing activities, because really what you're wanting to monitor is the outcome and what you're how effective you're being in your doing activities. And again, just remembering that those enabling activities don't actually have a purpose unless they are supporting one of those doing activities. And then finally at the top, you've got a purple control activity. And every organisation does this differently, but it might be a quarterly or 6-monthly or annual review, or end of a particular cycle where you will review what you're doing, how effective it's been, are you going to carry on with it, are you going to adapt it, or are you going to stop doing it altogether? And then that's obviously like a feedback loop and goes back around to your planning again. That's really the nub of it. So if you want to have a go at creating one of these, always start with the blue doing activities, then go down to the green enabling activities, back to the planning, and then add the monitoring and control in at the top. So there we go. There's an overview of business activity models. So I know Nicola's got some thoughts on how you could actually use this for data governance.
I do, yes. So I wish I had known about these years ago, to be fair, because when I am doing data governance and helping clients in the initial phases, the one thing I recommend doing is a conceptual data model. And to do that, I run a series of workshops where I sit down with each function or department and I ask them to tell me what data they use and produce. Now, sometimes, I'm just not allowed to. People say, no, we haven't hired you to help us do data models. We've hired you to help us do data governance. I go, no, but I need to know what data that you use and produce in your organization. And people sometimes just refuse to let me do them, which means it's a lot harder to work out that information. Or the other scenario I've often had is that people have been happy for me to do conceptual data models, but what they have struggled to give me the information because they really don't think in terms of data. So, when Jo was talking through the previous slide, she was talking about a clothing retailer. So people don't think about the data it takes to sell their clothes. They think about their clothes and perhaps a supply chain of getting the clothes to the stores and what happens when you return things, or, all those kind of practical things. And sometimes I found it really hard to get people to think about the data. So when we were preparing for this webinar and Jo said, I think one of the key techniques would be this, I went, wow, why didn't I know about this years ago? Because I really think this could be so useful in either of those scenarios, because you're going to get the same information out. So I think, and luckily Jo did agree with me when I was having a look at this, going, I really, really love this. This is great. And I think if you look at the green circles, the enabling things, they're the things that are mainly where the data sits. And that's the data that feeds the doing whatever it is your organization does. And I think, if you're tying into what an organization does, it's a lot easier for them to get their head around it. So they're quite happy to tell you. And I think in this slide, you used the example of a training company, didn't you, Jo? And it's quite easy to think, we do training, we do events. And then they can think about, in this case, this is actually an activity, but we know that there's going to be some data around that. So I think by doing a business activity model, you can actually get inside these people's heads and to start understanding what data is underlying all of these. So data fits very well in the enabling category. And not only that, but I think that once you've done that, you're actually in a really good position to look at all these green blobs and say, well, which of them is the most important to our doing activities? And if it's more important than others, then we need to focus our efforts, because that is the one thing that I love doing conceptual data models for, is that once I've got something drafted, I can say to people, which of the data is the most important to your organization? And that helps you then decide, where you're going to focus your efforts in your data governance initiative. So, for example, we've decided in this one that, if you're a training company and the main thing you focus on is delivering events, then, of all the data you have, perhaps the most important is going to be registrations and payments, because you're not going to do very well running events if you don't know who's supposed to be attending them, so that you can't contact them, tell them the details, tell them the address, where to turn up. And let's face it, cash flow is essential for whatever your company does. So we need to be able to capture the payments so that we can do even, perhaps boring things like bank reconciliations, but we can check that we've got the money that we were due. So I actually think this is a really good way to get inside your organization's heads, but in a way that doesn't involve you having to keep saying, no, but I mean the data, not the activity. What data do you need? You're actually able to talk about the activities, the things that they're very happy to talk about. They understand what their organization does and they understand what their function does. And I think that by then using this to have a conversation around data, around all the green blobs, is going to be absolutely vital. And I think when I told Jo my thoughts on this, you pointed out that you needed good quality data to be able to do the monitoring and control activities as well, didn't you? So yeah, I'm looking forward to trying one of these at a client. So I think this was a really good one. So I'm definitely looking forward to trying one. So thank you for that one, Jo.
That's all right. Right, okay, let's move on. So the next one that we're going to look at is really quick. This is the stakeholder wheel. So normally when you're thinking about who are your stakeholders going to be in a project or a program, it's pretty easy to identify the initial internal stakeholders. You might have an organisation chart that you look through. You might ask, senior colleagues or heads of department to nominate people and to sort of participant in your program. But there's a few risks associated with this. So first of all, you might not have sort of full representation of all the perspectives that really matter in what you're doing. But also there's a tendency that those people that get nominated internally are likely to be supporters of whatever it is that you're doing and really on board and helpful. But actually, you want a bit of the opposition in there too, so that you can really listen to what their concerns are and decide, whether those need to be factored in or whether they're just being awkward and annoying, and you should just kind of try and keep a lid on them. So the stakeholder wheel is just, again, it's another way of just being a bit more systematic and thinking about making sure that you've covered all bases. So again, it's just really a checklist, so that you can kind of just think, okay, so internally we've thought about owners who might be, shareholders, they might be trustees, they might be business owners. You've got your managers and then your employees, so who's actually doing the work. But then thinking about the external stakeholders, you've got quite a different range of things, and some of them may not be appropriate for your organisation. That's fine, you can just discount them. Some of them, you might have just sort of forgotten about really and not really considered them as stakeholders in your programme, and they might not be big players in it. But again, it's just kind of really useful to have gone through the process to think, is there anything in this group? Is there anyone in this group that we should, involve at any particular stages, or actually we've got nothing to sort of cover here? And again, it just means then that you can communicate and convey to others that you've really thoroughly thought about this and made sure that you've got all the bases covered. And again, you can share with them the approach that you've taken, and assure them that that you've been sort of really thorough and systematic in doing so. So that's it. This is a pretty simple one.
Yeah, and I think this is one that I had actually come across before, and I think this is really useful to get you thinking when you're doing data governance, because I find so many people get focused on the data governance roles, so the data owner, the data steward, and perhaps the other data governance roles, but they forget that there are lots of other people in your organization who have an interest in data. They may not end up being a data owner or a data steward, but you really ought to get them involved in your data governance initiative. And I think this is a really good way, almost like using this as a checklist, to make sure that you've got the right people involved, as Jo was saying. So if you kind of go around the wheel we've got here, you kind of, if we do the internal stakeholders first, you've got the owners. Well, they're likely to be, that's the audience where you're looking for a sponsor for your data governance initiative. Who's going to be the senior executive who puts their hand up and says, I'm supporting this data governance initiative and championing it across the organization. It's also going to be the bucket of stakeholders where you're likely to find your target data owners. I mean, let's be honest, at this early stage, if we're assuming we're doing it at an early stage, you probably don't know that they're definitely your data owners, and you won't necessarily tell them that, but they're the people that you need to start engaging with and understanding. If we look at, data stewards, you're going to be looking them in perhaps the not quite so senior population. So perhaps the managers. So this is a good way for you to start thinking about, so, if Jo is the data owner, who works for her? Who are the managers that work for her? And who are likely to be her data stewards? And then we've got the lovely kind of catch-all bucket called employees. And actually, whenever I'm telling anybody about the data producer and data consumer role, my kind of stock phrase is, well, this is more or less everybody in your organization. So that's an easy match. Most people in your organization either produce data or consume data. And to be honest, they probably do both. So, that's an easy one to sort out. If we go to the external side, we've got the partners. Now, these could be, your data consumers. They are going to be, perhaps people that, you send your data to once you've created it. So, they could be consuming your data externally. And I don't mean customers, as you see there at the bottom of the wheel, but they could equally be producers. So many organizations that, I've worked with these days buy data in from external companies, or even not necessarily buy the data in, but they acquire data or, use out external data as part of providing their services. And you need to be talking to these people because you need to understand, what kind of challenges they have around data. And particularly if you're using it, you'd like to kind of know the quality of it up front would be nice. If you move on to suppliers, again, we're fit in the same camp here. We've got data producers or data consumers. And, one horror story I tell on, I think on nearly every course I do, is that I did some work with a company many years ago now, who was actually told by their number one supplier that their data was so bad that they were going to refuse to continue supplying them if they didn't sort their data out. And they gave them 6 months to sort their data out. Hence, I went in to help them do the data governance. You never want to be in that situation that one of your key suppliers just decides that your data is so bad that it's too hard to work with. So definitely you need to be talking to suppliers. Now, I know this is a little bit difficult sometimes, and I've had some interesting conversations with people because you can't just suddenly pick up the phone and go, oh, hello, my name's Nicola, I'm helping this company do some data governance, and I just wanted to talk to you about the quality of your data. Clearly that's not going to happen. But what you need to be doing is, if you've got some key suppliers that you think need to be involved in this, is find out who the relationship managers are in your organization and talk to them. They've built up the relationships, and they're probably the people that will have those conversations, not you. But you need to be building up good relationships with them and having those conversations. Then we get to regulators, the dreaded regulators. Not every industry has regulators, but very many do. And if you're working in an organization that does have a regulator, you're going to be providing reports of various types in way of providing evidence that you are meeting the requirements of the regulator. So this makes them data consumers, but not only that, it kind of makes them key data consumers, because the one thing you don't want to do is upset your regulator. So again, this is probably not one where you go and, pick up the phone to your regulator and say, oh, we were just thinking about improving our data, because you probably wouldn't want to tell them that you were worried about it in the first place. But what you can do is look at their requirements. And, I've obviously worked many sectors these days, but I would say, quite honestly, the majority of my experience has been in financial services. And the Bank of England and the FSA, as it was before, when that was responsible for the regulation before it got absorbed into the Bank of England, regularly produce what they call thematic reviews. So I would encourage you to look at whatever industry regulator you have, look at whatever they publish online, because they will tell you what they want from your data. You don't actually have to go and talk to them face to face and ask them loads of questions, but they do make things very clear. And what you need to do is be doing that to make sure you're doing the right things to keep them happy. And then finally, and it's definitely not a case of last and least, because this is our customers. This is what we're in business for, whatever we're doing, and we need to keep them happy. And let's face it, most of the time, our customers will probably be data producers. They'll be giving us their details. And these days we have an awful lot of self-service. We put things online. We can't go around training all of our customers on how to give us data, good data quality and why it's important they get things entered correctly. But we need to work out what we can do to influence them and to improve the quality of data. And I've worked with, with organizations who've emailed customers to explain why a certain piece of data is really, really important, and it's important in order for them to provide a better service or product. And customers have reacted really well to that. So it's all a way of how you do that. And so whilst I say it's probably not, you don't start running customer focus groups because you're doing a data governance program, but what you can do is perhaps go to your customer complaints team. Who deals with that? Let's see, what are the most complaints you get? And how many of them are down to poor quality data, because that will give you a really good clue on some areas that you need to focus on. So I just think this is a really good checklist at the beginning of a data governance initiative to make sure you've thought about everybody that you need to, at the very least, contact, because they might say to you, I'm not interested, the data I use is perfect, thanks. But this is a really good, make sure that nothing has slipped through the net before you've even started.
That's great. Thank you, Nicola. Lots of really good examples there of how to sort of make use of this. Okay, so the last one that we're going to cover today is Kotter's change model. So I learned about this quite a long time ago, and was having a dig around on Google for an image to show you of the model, and it's been considerably updated since I learned about it, and it's now a circle and the wording has been changed, but fundamentally it's the same. If you go to kotterinc.com, not only can you access a copy of this model, but loads of really useful resources and guidance of how to use it, how to think about it, how to apply it. So I'd really recommend going and having a look at that. So that's what you'll see when you go there. But what click on that again. What I'm more familiar with was this kind of much more sort of step-by-step approach where you were sort of building layer upon layer. And as you can see, there are sort of 3 phases that he talks about. So we'll go briefly through each of those in turn, and again Nicola's going to sort of add in some ideas and insight at each stage as we go through, and we'll have a little bit of a roundup at the end. Right, so the first step is create a sense of urgency. So this is really, why are we doing this? What's this all about? What's the purpose? And obviously sort of it's really key usually here to think about, what are the consequences of not doing this, not changing the way we work, not making a change. So at this stage, you'd be talking to those stakeholder groups, referring back to the stakeholder wheel, about what it is that you're doing and why. So we've put a couple of questions in here about why is it important to have data governance, and what are the consequences of not managing your data properly. So hopefully, those would be things that you're feeling really secure about. Nicola, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, because I think in my experience, all too many people just dive into doing data governance because they've been told to, and they haven't done this step. They don't understand why it's important to have data governance for their organization. And I think if you miss this, then you're really going to struggle to have any success, because what you've got to be able to answer whoever you're talking to of your stakeholders is what's in it for them. And if all that's in it for them is a lot of overhead and maintenance and giving you information that was in their head, but they don't get any benefits, it's going to be really hard to convince them that it's a good idea. So what you've got to understand is, the first question here, why do you need data governance? Perhaps another way to think about it is, why do you need better quality data? I was actually working on some training for a client this morning, and we've been recording some little snippets, not me as the expert trainer, but as some of their key consumers, doing stories of what goes wrong at that company because the data's not good enough or it's not available. And that's really sending a really resounding message, because this isn't, whoever it is, whether it's, the data governance manager or an external consultant or whatever it is, this isn't somebody saying we need data governance for best practice. You need it to solve some problems and some pain points that your organization has. And I think if you can find those problems, then you can create this sense of urgency.
Yeah, I love, changing it a theoretical thing to do because it's best practice and it's what everyone else is doing, to actually, what does it mean for our business? And some horror stories and pain points for the sorts of things it's going to prevent everybody having to experience. Okay, so the next one, step 2, forming a powerful coalition. So this is getting your team together, not necessarily a formal team, but who are the people that you're going to get on board to really champion this. So it's really important. Change needs to be led, not just managed. So you've got to have somebody that's championing it, leading it, appreciates the purpose, has that vision, and lives and breathes it. And I really like this recommendation from Kotter that this coalition should not just be senior leaders, but try and get people from across at all different levels, all different departments. And, particularly good is to have people who are really well respected within your organisation and can bring unique expertise or experience. Because again, that's just going to really give you different perspectives and make you a really, really strong team working together.
Yeah, and I think that's so true, and I've seen that in practice. So, totally agree. You need a strong leader who is your sponsor in this instance for your data governance, and they need to be interested in it. And I would even say, you perhaps have to come back to this and revisit it if your sponsor changes. So I had an instance where I think it was the chief risk officer of an organization was the sponsor for data governance, and he moved on. And the new chief risk officer arrived, very nice man, but just went, I really don't get this. I don't get it. And he said, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing it, but I don't think I'm going to be your best sponsor and supporter because I don't understand what you're doing. So he actually was really great, and he helped me to find somebody else at the exec level to take on as the executive sponsor for us. So that's really, really important, because this guy knew that he was accountable for it. He accepted that, but he didn't feel he could lead it in any way. And that different levels is really, really important. And that comes back to your stakeholders. When you're looking at all those stakeholders, that's where you can think about these people. They might not be a data owner, but they might be a really key ally when you're doing this. And I can think of actually more than one organization where the enterprise data architect has become my chief ally. And one company in particular that comes to mind, Colin was so well respected across the whole organization, both in IT and in the business units, because if Colin didn't know where it was, why it was broken, what the history of it was, then nobody did. And if Colin said, I think we really ought to listen to what Nicola's saying and do data governance, people that had previously perhaps been a little bit resistant suddenly went, oh, wow, if Colin says, we perhaps ought to listen to this mad data governance person. So, I really think that is true, is that you need those people across different levels, and the people who perhaps are respected but slightly lower down in an organization have a bit more of a detailed understanding of how your organization works and any challenges they have, and they'll be able to really help you out and add some valuable support.
Yeah, they can be real advocates. And I think that's a really good example, Nicola, of that person moving on, where you've been making sort of pretty good progress on a program of change, and then that key person leaves, and then after a while, and it might take a little bit of time, but the program starts to wobble a bit, and it's just not got the momentum that it had. And so again, this is where this model is really helpful, because it just can kind of help you sort of think through, well, what are all the elements? What's the bit that's missing? And then all of a sudden you can go, oh, it's because we've lost the person that's leading it. And then, and it might not be apparent really quickly, but again, it's just really sort of useful to apply this process to whatever it is you're doing, and help you kind of spot where the problems are, and then identify what it is that needs to be addressed. Okay, so moving on. The third step is creating a vision for change. So conveying, how much better the future is going to be for your organisation, because you'll have data governance in place, a framework there. So Cotter says that one of the really useful things you can do is create a short strapline that's easy for your team and stakeholders to remember. So I had a go at this, it's a bit wordy, but Nicola's got a much better example from one of her clients, which I'll let her share.
I wish I'd thought of it, but I'm always happy to share it to help inspire other people. So they realized they needed to do data governance because they were doing a much bigger data analytics program, and they wanted to do some really clever stuff with their data. And, across the whole organization, people were very excited about this program. Then they realized that data wasn't all that good in places, and they realized they needed to do data governance as well. And they started doing data governance, and they were a little bit upset that they weren't getting the same reactions. If we come to you and say, oh, Joe, we're going to do this amazing analysis and give you new opportunities for your business, and Joe goes, oh, that's fabulous, I'll have some of that. And they go, oh, by the way, Joe, we're also going to do data governance. She goes, oh, I don't want that, I just want the first bit, that sounds much more exciting. So they actually came up with a strapline that just says data governance enables you to do the cool stuff. And it worked really, really well for them, because they were became known as
we have to go and talk to the data governance team, because otherwise we can't get the other exciting stuff that the other part of the project's talking about.
Yeah, I'm completely going to steal that and use it everywhere. Okay, so we are now moving on to the second phase. So step 4, communicating the vision. So, throughout the programme, you have got to communicate what you're doing to the right people, the right level of detail, the right kind of frequency. So it's really, really important to take time to sort of plan who are all these people, what are you going to share with them, how are you going to do that, and then obviously delivering on that plan. So there's some things to think about when you're developing your communication plan. And I think, Nicola, you always say, like, a little bit more is better than a little bit too less.
Yes, I often say you can't over communicate data governance, because I'll challenge you. If you manage to over communicate it, please tell me, because I've personally never managed it. And I really agree with what Joe's saying about, you need to have a plan, and it needs to be written down on something concrete. Because, and actually, the questions that Joe's put on the slide here are almost like the column headings of your communication plan, because what you need to be doing is thinking this through. And I can tell you, and you probably know if you're doing data governance and listening to this webinar, you've got so many balls in the air and you're juggling so many things when you're doing a data governance initiative, that communications are probably the one thing that I particularly forget about. And it's not that I don't want to do them. I mean, I train people and tell them how important they are, but you just don't have time for everything. And for me, communicating things is what often slips. And if I didn't have a plan, I couldn't go back to see what was I supposed to do, what haven't I done. I would just be firefighting, doing a knee-jerk reaction, and perhaps doing the wrong communication. So at least by having a plan, it keeps me honest and focused on the right communications, even if they're sometimes a little bit later than they ideally should be.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a really good thing to sort of plan as a team, if you have got a team around you, and and assigning responsibilities for who's going to do which communications, and break it down if you can, and share the load, because there is quite a lot to it. All right, so moving on, the next one, step 5. So empower, action, and remove obstacles. This is really about, there's a lot of listening at this point, and building rapport with people internally. So this is really looking at, what are the barriers to us, making sort of real progress, and you might want to, engage with some other people internally to help you overcome those. So larger organisations may have the luxury of a change specialist, which is great, and they can kind of really help you out with this kind of stuff. You might want to go and talk to HR, line managers, especially if you're looking at structures changing, job responsibilities. How are you going to manage or incorporate these kinds of changes into performance management, and new recruits and training and so on. So there's quite a lot of incorporating into sort of other people's areas of work. It's really, really important to recognise and reward those people who have, embraced the change, and celebrate that, and make it known that, because of their support and their interest and their engagement, that, you're really making traction, and they're really making a difference to, their part of the organisation, and hopefully make other people feel a bit jealous. And a really, really key thing here, and this can be really tough, but those that are, against you and in opposition, really try and take the time to talk to them, listen to them, accept their views. It's not necessarily about, trying to persuade them at this stage to change their views, but really think about, are the obstacles that they are presenting to you, are those valid, and do they need to be taken into account in your plans, or is it just hot air and they're just being annoying, and does their influence need to be managed somehow, or can you just kind of leave them to mumble away in the corner by themselves? But if they're going to do harm to your program, then it needs to be dealt with in a slightly more assertive manner. So Nicola, I'm sure you've had experience of that before.
Yes, there's one person in particular that comes to mind with that, and this stakeholder in question actually tore up my data governance policy and threw it at me across the meeting room table, and it took every tactic and technique I've ever learned to deal with him. But as you say, he was having a negative impact. And what I didn't want him to do was to upset my other data owners who were being really good and supportive and doing everything I wanted to do. So yeah, I mean, we didn't, I didn't feel the need to add any data governance bits to this, because it would have been just a repeat of the bullets that Joe would put on here for the actual change management approach, because I've done all of these things as part of a data governance program. And I think you've got to find ways to manage all of these things. The one thing I would say, the one that I've found the hardest, is engaging with HR to get job descriptions changed, or objectives added to people's appraisals. Loads of clients have asked me to do that. I think it's a really good thing, and I think it's really worthwhile. I think what you possibly have to do is accept that you may have to do that a bit later down the line, when people have seen the value of doing data governance, then they're willing to formalize it. At the start, if you start saying, and we need to change, structures, job descriptions and everything, people start getting a bit twitchy. So definitely a good thing, but at the right time. So yeah, I would say, yeah, embrace all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, these are the things, you probably spotted, these are the sorts of activities that when these are when these are happening, this is when you're really, really starting to embed the change in the culture of your organisation. So it's no longer, an initiative that's kind of floating along the top, and we're how will it go, and is it going to really help us? But this is really sort of starting to embed things, throughout, like, the roots going through the soil, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to remove all of this once these things have been put in place. So this is kind of really, really starting to get some solidity behind what you're doing. Right, so moving on to the next one, we're almost there. Step 6, create quick wins. Everybody loves a quick win, and data governance, unfortunately, is notoriously slow for realising benefits. Nick might have some ideas on how long it might typically take to really get going, but it's long, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to say you're probably 6 months getting going and designing your framework before you really start implementing much. And then you could be 1 year to 2 years before you really start saying that you're getting regular benefits from it.
Yeah, so it's definitely a long burn. But we've talked a couple of times about how getting your issue resolution process in place is probably one of the best places to start, about being able to demonstrate some benefits. So you may not have all the other elements in place, but if people are starting to report to you data quality issues and you can get those resolved, that's something that's really, really worth shouting about and sharing. Another approach you might want to take is piloting in a more discreet area, so that you can kind of really get some traction there. But again, that might come with controversy. But generally speaking, the earlier you start to get any kind of benefits, the quicker and the easier it is to build momentum around the change. And it's just so important to constantly communicate and demonstrate the benefits that you've brought along. And again, that kind of ties back to the communication plan. So you probably want to think about that a bit when you're developing a communication plan, because you might not want to sort of think, oh, well, we give an update to those stakeholders once every 2 months, and by then this news of something that you've just sorted out is a bit old. You might want to think about reporting back on a bit more of an ad hoc basis. Anyway, over to Nicola for some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on the data quality issue resolution process, because exactly what Joe said, totally advocate that. Get that in place as soon as you can, even if you're still fine-tuning your data governance framework and things, but try to do that. But the one thing to bear in mind is, once you're a little bit more embedded in BAU, I would be saying you need to prioritize the data quality issues and find a way of categorizing them so that you put your efforts on the most material or the most critical issues. But then I don't do that in the early days, because some data quality issues that you're going to see may be material and they may be very critical, but they're going to take a really long time to fix. So it doesn't mean you don't start trying to fix them. But what I would do is look for things that you can create these quick wins from. So things that would be perhaps of interest across a wider audience in your organization. So don't fix the one thing that's one tiny little department and go, oh, thank you for doing that. Try and fix something that will go across everywhere. So I can tell you one example. I was helping an organization do data governance at the same time as they were running their GDPR program 2 or 3 years ago. And not long before the GDPR program was stood up, we had a report of a data quality issue that customer email addresses weren't all that good. And this was by some poor person in marketing who had to try and do some cleansing and fixing every time they tried to run a marketing campaign. But we took that to everybody and nobody was interested because it didn't hurt them enough. And this poor chap still had to carry on doing all his cleansing and everything. And then we were sitting at probably the first program board for the GDPR program, and I'd been asked to join that and see how data governance could help with the program. And it was, to be honest, a lot of it was really technical and wasn't really of interest to me. And then somebody suddenly went, and anyway, we've decided that we're going to save a lot of money and help our environmental credentials by not sending letters to everybody with the privacy statement. We're going to email everybody. At which point my ears pricked up and I went, actually, you might have a problem with that one, because we knew at that point 40% of customer email addresses were corrupt or missing. And that suddenly became a really high priority issue, which had been dismissed and nobody would look at literally weeks before. And that was a huge quick win. We fixed that. That got reported to the CEO, who at that point asked for monthly data governance updates to the executive committee meetings. So we suddenly got a lot of senior interest by fixing one. So I think sometimes, in the early days, choose your data quality issues to fix with care, because they can really help you deliver these quick wins and engagement in your process.
Yeah, that's fantastic. When people are actually asking you for information about progress, then that's great. You don't have to try and persuade them to read what you've said.
Very true.
Okay, right. So the last one, build on the change. So this is really about, keep the momentum going. Just, keep telling people about, all the benefits, how it's doing really well, roll out to other areas, every milestone that you hit, just keep telling everybody about it. So it's whereas the step before is really about building momentum, this one is about maintaining momentum. So it's just sort of the maturity of that. And the last step then in phase 3 is making it stick. And this is really where you are making that transformation from data governance being an initiative or a project to business as usual. So don't stop sharing reports of progress and those benefits. Go back to, how well has this been embedded into your practices about recruitment and training, because you should get to the point where the new people that come on board have absolutely no knowledge of how things were done previously. And again, referring back to what Nicola said about that chap who was leading the program, the project sponsor who left, really think about succession planning, because you don't want all this hard work to be lost, because those people they will move on at some point. So again, sort of really thinking about which job description should it be in, who's accountable for this, who's got responsibilities, because at this point you really, it should be sort of not managing itself, but it's not about doing new stuff. It's just about sustaining what's being put into place, and constantly improving and refining, but you should really have 95% of it solidly in place.
Yeah, and I always like to say to people, you need to continue your communications plan for this reason, or when you're doing your communications plan, make one of the things you put on there, is this a one-off communication or just for the duration of the, perhaps the implementation phases, or is this a regular, quarterly update from the data governance team? Is it a monthly update on these are the data quality issues that we've fixed? And I think that's one way to keep that message going.
Yeah. Okay, and so that is the end of it.
Excellent. So thank you, Joe. I do hope everybody's found that useful. We've got a few questions and we've got about 8 minutes. So if you've got any other questions, please add them in the chat now and we'll get through as many as we can. So, and I think most of these, as long as they're about business analysis, are for Joe. So, sorry, Joe. So what we've got here is, have you got any tips on cheap or free software to use for business activity models? She said,
yeah. So Visio's mentioned there. So if you've got that where you work, you can create business activity models in that. I tend to use Lucid Chart, and there's another one called Gliffy, and they're not a huge amount to pay for a subscription for the year. They've got the ovals, they've got the wiggly lines. You can colour them in how you like. I don't particularly like using the template ones for just creating my own ones. But yeah, that's a good way to get started.
Excellent. And Nigel's actually shared some great advice a little bit further down. He said that FreeMind or Mind Maple are both open source mind mapping tools.
Okay.
And he said, he does, Visio, as we know, isn't free. So he, it's good to know that there's some free tools out there as well for people that if they want to use them. So excellent. Yeah, and I suppose a mind mapping tool is exactly the right thing for that kind of diagram, isn't it, Jay?
Exactly. And it doesn't, I wouldn't get too hung up on the style and the presentation. What's most important is the information. And again, I say to clients, don't worry too much about what's in each box. As long as you've got everything, it doesn't really matter too much, what's connected to what. The whole point is you've got everything covered. So yeah, I mean, just, if you're really on a tight budget, just use whatever's going to convey the same information.
Yeah, that's useful advice. Thanks, Joe. Now, George has said, I don't know whether this is a statement or a question, but looking at the stakeholder wheel, I normally make a clear difference in the business line, information line, and IT lines. It's because he's saying, I think what we shared looks like the basis for our data operation model. So do you normally differentiate between business and IT when you're doing the stakeholder analysis using the wheel, Joe?
Well, I wouldn't, but then I typically work in much smaller organisations. So there's not necessarily that need to, but, for larger enterprises, that might be, much, much more helpful.
That's true. And I think it's fair to say, because we were probably coming at this from a business point of view because data governance is primarily business, but I always include a role for IT called data custodian. So I could have equally put that on some of those bubbles on the stakeholder wheel. So yeah, good point. Thank you, George.
Again, you can always adapt these, change the terms if they don't work for your organization. I mean, they are industry standard models, but every organization is different. So, adapt and, make it work for you.
Excellent. So Christopher's come up with a question. So he'd be curious to know what's the best way to define the scope within the stakeholder model. So he's in higher education. He has internal suppliers, so maybe other university divisions to the one he's in, but he also has external suppliers and vendors and the like.
So scope, do you mean scope in terms of how far your data governance framework is to reach?
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because I think that you asking that question, Joe, probably answers it. It's the your scope when you're doing your stakeholders is, if you were doing it from a data governance point of view, is the scope of your end game for data governance, because even if you are doing data governance maybe only in your division at the moment, perhaps if you're planning to roll it out, you need to design something that suits the whole organization. Otherwise, it's not scalable. So, I normally try and identify all of my stakeholders, even if my initial conversations with them are, I just want to say normally I'm doing a conceptual data model, but perhaps next time it's going to be a business activity model with them so that I can get my head around their data. But I say to them, we're going to do data governance. We're coming up with a phased implementation. And once we have a clearer idea on when we're going to involve you, I'll get back to you. But you need to make sure, even if it's talking to, you're saying here you've got other university divisions. That's what I love with the work I've done with universities. They're almost like a number of different companies all within one organization, which can make life interesting. So perhaps you might go and talk to somebody because you need them on board and know what you're doing, but say to them, you know, I will only need to talk to you if we've got a data quality issue with your data or something like that, and then we'll come back to you in the future. So I hope that helped, Christopher.
I think, you know, go back to whatever, well, if it's data governance, look at, you know, just as Nicola said, but if it's any other kind of project, just refer back to what the scope of the project is and work it from there. And again, it can be quite useful sometimes to document that you've decided that, you know, someone is outside of scope, because if you get questioned later on, you can say, oh, we did consider it, but discounted them for this reason. So again, just kind of using it to go through that systematic process of, you know, who's in and who's out.
That's a really good.
Right.
Hannah shared a recommendation for a book to support phase 2, step 5, and I can't remember which step 5 was now. That's Bob Siner's book, Non-Invasive Data Governance.
That's Overcoming Obstacles.
Yes. So thank you for that recommendation. Yes, that is a good book by Robert Siner. I realised that without thinking I just called him Bob because that's what I call him when I'm talking to him. But I think his book's published under his full name. George has said the most risky thing is hidden resistance. So I try to get the resistance people on board to participate and prove with them, you know, that it's a worthy thing. So I suppose my question with you, Joe, is how do you even find the hidden resistance? Because I totally agree with George's approach.
I suppose, you know, the classic way to spot them are, you know, they're the people that always cancel the meetings, or just don't turn up. But also, because I think one of the main areas of resistance, certainly around data quality, is people who are actually quite scared of data, and they're in quite a senior role, and they've not got any kind of data management background. They're a bit scared of IT often, and so they, you know, they just want to, you know, leave it to somebody else to deal with. So I'm not so sure really how you spot the hidden resistance, but if you're using that stakeholder wheel, it should help you kind of identify, well, you know, we want to include these managers and, you know, these senior leaders and so on. And then, you know, hopefully that would then uncover, well, you know, how come we've got, you know, these functional areas or these departments covered, but we haven't really got much traction here. So, you know, maybe that will point to, you know, where that resistance is, you know, those people that just, you know, desperately back off as soon as data is mentioned.
Yes, no, that does happen a lot. So we've just got a couple of minutes, but I think we're going to just about manage this. So we've got, how do you fix all those email addresses? Sorry, not quite on topic, but just intrigued. Actually, yeah, it sounded a bigger deal than it really was, because we thought we just didn't have them, you know, and I was getting ready to do training courses for the call center because they were clearly being rubbish in capturing email address. But it turned out that actually at the point of capture, they were pretty good. There was a system fault that was corrupting them. And we were able to go back and fix most of them from internal records. So that was an easy one. George has asked if you get the slides somewhere afterwards. Yes, if you follow the link that's on the slide in front of us at the moment, you can ask us for the slides. We didn't want to fill up everybody's inboxes, but if you just put in your details there and tell us you want the slides, we will be very happy to share them with you. And then Mauricio has just said, in the stakeholders will, I think data enablers should be differentiated from pure producers and consumers since they have different interests and management processes. Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Mauricio. And I think it depends on your organization. And I think I haven't used the term data enabler, but I've used something similar in the past, and that's in organizations where that's appropriate to do so. So I think, and Joe said earlier, you know, you've got to use the terms and the you know, the terminology that works for your organization. So yeah, I would definitely see putting data enablers on there as well could work really well for the right organization. So I think we are dead on the hour. So thank you so much for joining us. We do hope you found it useful. And just remember, follow that link if you want to get in touch about anything, and or if you'd like a copy of the slides.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.